On March 17, 1982, in the hills of the Ozark Mountains in Missouri, as spring's thaw began revealing the winter's secrets, a social worker named Margaret Wilson visited an isolated cabin in Shannon County. What she discovered there would forever alter her understanding of the limits of social isolation and the consequences of institutional neglect in rural American communities. The Shelton family's property was located 27 kilometers from the nearest town, Current River. A dirt road, which became impassable during spring rains, was the only way to access it. The family had lived with virtually no contact with the outside world for over 3 decades. Margaret's visit was prompted by an anonymous complaint received by the Missouri Department of Social Services, alleging that children were living in unsanitary conditions and potentially suffering from abuse. Upon her arrival, Margaret was greeted by Elijah Shelton, 47, a man of average height with a gray beard and intense blue eyes that seemed to carry the weight of generations of isolation. Elijah lived in a cabin with his sister, Martha Shelton, 43, and 3 children, Thomas, 12, Suddy, 9, and little Jacob, only 5 years old. The 2-bedroom cabin, which also included a kitchen and a living room, was a wooden structure built by Elijah's grandfather in the 1920s. The property also had a small barn, a vegetable garden, and a well. There was no electricity or running water. Their isolation was nearly complete, with only occasional trips to town for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. That day's weather was mild, with a temperature of 17 degrees Celsius and partial cloudiness. The recent thaw had left the ground around the cabin muddy, and the air held the distinctive smell of damp earth and decaying wood. During her initial inspection, Margaret observed that the children showed signs of mild malnutrition and a lack of basic medical care. Thomas had a poorly healed scar on his right arm from an axe accident the previous year. Suddy had a slight strabismus that had never been treated. Jacob, the youngest, showed signs of cognitive developmental delay for his age. What most struck Margaret, however, were the physical resemblances between the children and the 2 adults. They all shared striking features, the same intense blue eyes, the same facial bone structure, the same ear shape. These characteristics suggested not only a family bond but also a very close consanguinity. When asked about the children's mother, Elijah hesitated before answering that his wife had died while giving birth to Jacob. Martha remained silent, avoiding eye contact with the social worker. It was at this moment that Margaret began to suspect the story didn't make sense. Shannon County records showed no marriage certificate for Elijah Shelton. In fact, the only documents found were the birth certificates of Elijah and Martha, children of Harold and Edith Shelton, and a land ownership record from 1924. The children had no official birth certificates. The Shelton family had become increasingly isolated after the death of Elijah and Martha's parents in a 1973 fire. Since then, the siblings had severed almost all ties with the local community, only visiting town for essential needs. Current River residents described Elijah as a reserved and suspicious man who avoided long interactions. The first suspicions that Martha might be the children's biological mother began to form in Margaret's mind as she observed the family dynamics. She noticed the way Jacob clung to Martha's skirt, how she intuitively knew each child's needs, and how her gaze revealed a deep maternal bond that went beyond that of an aunt. If you want to follow more cases like this that shake society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigations. The formal investigation into the Shelton case began on March 24, 1982, 1 week after Margaret Wilson's first visit. The Missouri Department of Social Services, working with the Shannon County Sheriff, sent a team to assess the situation. The team included Margaret, police officer David Tanner, and pediatrician Dr. Robert Hayes. The team's first obstacle was Elijah's resistance. When confronted with more direct questions about the children's origins, he became defensive, asserting that the authorities had no right to interfere in his family's life. "We take care of our own," he repeated, a phrase that would later prove to be loaded with a disturbing meaning. Martha, in turn, remained silent, answering only with monosyllables when directly questioned. The children showed a mix of curiosity and fear toward the visitors, a clear sign of their limited contact with people outside the family unit. Dr. Hayes performed basic physical exams on the children and noted several worrying signs. In addition to mild malnutrition and a lack of preventive medical care, he observed physical characteristics that could indicate genetic problems consistent with endogamy. Thomas had polydactyly, an extra finger on his left hand. Suddy had dental development problems, and Jacob's cognitive impairment appeared more severe than initially perceived. These signs, when viewed in isolation, can have various causes, Dr. Hayes explained in his report. But when observed together, along with shared physical characteristics and the family's isolation, they raise serious concerns about possible consanguinity. The investigation took a more precise direction when the team gained access to the family's few medical records. In 1970, Martha had been treated at a hospital in a neighboring county after a domestic accident. The doctor noted she was 3 months pregnant. However, there was no record of a birth or adoption during this period. A deeper search of the records revealed a pattern. Martha had been treated at different regional hospitals in 1970, 1973, and 1977, years that corresponded approximately to the ages of Thomas, Suddy, and Jacob. On each occasion, she used different names, but the basic physical descriptions and medical data indicated it was the same person. The investigation hit a significant roadblock when Elijah, sensing the direction of events, barred the investigators from entering the property. Legally, without concrete evidence of abuse or severe neglect, the authorities had limited options for intervention. It was at this point that a crucial witness emerged. Sarah Jenkins, an 83-year-old woman who lived about 5 kilometers from the Sheltons' property, contacted Margaret after hearing rumors about the investigation. Sarah revealed she had been a friend of Edith, Elijah, and Martha's mother, and had maintained sporadic contact with the family even after they became isolated. Edith was always afraid something like this would happen, Sarah said. Harold kept the family isolated, saying the world was corrupt and that they could only trust their own blood. When they died in that fire, I tried to help the children, but Elijah was already so much like his father, suspicious and hostile. Sarah revealed she had visited the cabin a few times after the parents' death, bringing supplies and offering help. During one of these visits in 1971, she noticed that Martha was visibly pregnant. When she questioned him about it, Elijah threw her off the property and forbade her from returning. I should have done something back then, Sarah lamented. But who would have believed me? And where would those children have ended up? The system doesn't take good care of our own here. Sarah's testimony provided important context, but it wasn't definitive proof. The investigation needed concrete evidence to intervene. A breakthrough occurred when one of the agents re-examined Elijah and Martha's birth records and discovered something intriguing. Their parents, Harold and Edith Shelton, shared the same last name before marriage. Subsequent investigations revealed they were first cousins. This isn't uncommon in isolated communities like this, explained a local historian consulted by the team. In the early decades of the 20th century, many families in mountainous regions lived in such isolation that marriages between close relatives ended up happening due to a lack of other options. In some cases, it became almost a family tradition, justified by beliefs about blood purity. This discovery shed new light on the case. It wasn't just a possible incestuous relationship between Elijah and Martha but potentially a generational pattern of endogamy that had intensified over time. The team developed a new theory. Elijah and Martha's parents, who were already cousins, had passed on their isolationist beliefs to their children. After the parents' death, the siblings, already socially isolated and possibly influenced by distorted ideas about family and purity, established an incestuous relationship that resulted in the birth of 3 children. The investigation hit a snag when a local resident claimed to have seen a different woman on the Shelton property in the early 1970s. This information briefly supported the theory that a third person might have been involved, perhaps Elijah's wife, who later disappeared. However, subsequent investigations revealed that the witness had likely confused the property or the date. Sheriff John Pearson began to consider obtaining a court order to collect DNA samples from the children and adults. However, the legal process would be complicated, especially given the family's isolation and the lack of conclusive evidence of abuse or neglect to justify such an invasive intervention. "We have to be careful here," the sheriff argued. "These people have lived this way for generations. For them, this is their normal way of life. If we invade the property without concrete evidence, we could lose any chance of helping these children." The investigation reached an impasse that would last for several months. During that period, the Department of Social Services maintained regular visits to the property, monitoring the children's well-being and gradually attempting to build a relationship of trust with the family. The real turning point in the Shelton case occurred in September 1982, 6 months after the investigation began. During one of her routine visits, Margaret Wilson noticed that Jacob, the youngest, had a high fever and signs of a severe respiratory infection. Despite Elijah's initial resistance, she managed to persuade him to allow the child to be taken to the hospital in West Plains, the nearest major city. At the hospital, Dr. Michael Brennan, a genetics specialist who had been consulted on the case, took the opportunity to perform more in-depth tests with the reluctant consent of Elijah, who accompanied his son. The results of Jacob's exams revealed multiple subtle congenital anomalies that, individually, might have gone unnoticed, but together formed a pattern consistent with a high degree of consanguinity. "The genetic markers we're observing here," Dr. Brennan told the investigation team, "are typical of children born from first-degree sibling relationships. There's excessive homozygosity for a relationship between even first-degree cousins." During Jacob's 2-week hospitalization due to complications from pneumonia, Martha remained constantly by his side, showing a striking level of maternal care and anxiety. It was during this period that Martha, physically and emotionally exhausted, finally began to open up to Margaret. One night, while Jacob slept under the influence of medication, Martha shared fragments of her story. She spoke about the growing isolation after her parents' death, how Elijah had gradually assumed the role of family patriarch, and how the boundaries between family roles began to blur. "We didn't know anyone," Martha confessed in an almost inaudible whisper. "Elijah said the outside world wanted to separate us, to harm us. We could only trust each other." Although Martha didn't explicitly admit to being the children's biological mother in this conversation, her words and emotions made the situation increasingly clear to Margaret. The social worker, taking extreme care not to break the fragile trust that was being established, avoided asking direct questions about paternity, focusing on offering emotional support instead. Meanwhile, the documentary investigation continued. A significant breakthrough occurred when researchers located a traveling pastor, Reverend Samuel Miller, who had visited isolated communities in the Ozark Hills during the 1960s and 1970s. Reverend Miller kept detailed journals of his visits, including observations on the families he encountered. An entry dated June 1969 described a visit to the Shelton property. "I visited the Shelton family today. Their parents recently died in tragic circumstances, leaving 2 adult children, Elijah, 34, and Martha, 30. I found them living in extreme poverty and isolation. I offered spiritual and material assistance, but I was met with suspicion, especially by the young Elijah. Something about the dynamic between the siblings seemed disturbing to me. Martha appeared submissive, almost fearful. I fear that without the moderating influence of their parents, as isolationists as they were, the situation could deteriorate. I intend to go back, but I confess that I feel powerless." A later entry from April 1971 was even more revealing. "I returned to the Shelton property after nearly 2 years. I was prevented from entering by Elijah, who seemed even more hostile and paranoid. From a distance, I caught a brief glimpse of Martha. She appeared to be in an advanced state of pregnancy. When I mentioned this to Elijah, suggesting they might need medical attention, he became furious, accusing me of spreading lies and threatening to assault me if I didn't leave immediately. I reported my concerns to the local sheriff, but they said that without concrete evidence of abuse, nothing could be done. These mountains hold their secrets, and I fear some are too dark to bear the light of day." Reverend Miller's diary provided the first contemporary evidence of Martha's pregnancy, corroborating the investigation's suspicions. Another crucial event occurred when authorities managed to locate medical records from a Springfield hospital where Martha had been treated in 1977 under the name Mary Smith. The records confirmed she had been hospitalized in advanced labor and had given birth to a boy with multiple health complications, including breathing problems and a slight heart defect. The birth date coincided with Jacob's approximate age. The medical team at the time noted concerns about possible genetic abnormalities and suggested more tests, but Mary Smith left the hospital against medical advice as soon as her condition and the baby stabilized. While Jacob recovered at the hospital, Dr. Brennan, with limited judicial authorization, performed additional tests that revealed the boy had a rare genetic condition called Apert syndrome, characterized by malformations of the skull, face, hands, and feet. This syndrome can occur spontaneously, but its incidence increases significantly in cases of close consanguinity. Based on the new evidence, Judge Elalina Simmons issued a warrant authorizing DNA tests for all the Shelton children and adults. The results, obtained in November 1982, were conclusive. Elijah was the biological father and Martha, the biological mother of all 3 children. Leave a comment. Never give up on the truth if you believe all cases of family abuse deserve to be investigated, no matter how isolated the community. On December 7, 1982, based on the genetic evidence and collected testimonies, Elijah Shelton was formally charged with incest, a Class D felony in Missouri, punishable with up to 4 years in prison. Martha, considered a victim due to evidence of prolonged psychological coercion, did not face criminal charges, but her ability to care for the children was questioned in court. Elijah Shelton's trial began in February 1983 and, despite efforts to keep the case relatively discreet and protect the children's privacy, it attracted significant regional media attention. The Shannon County Court hosted one of the most complex and morally challenging cases in its history. During the trial, Elijah's defense, led by public defender Gerald Thompson, argued that the extreme isolation and dysfunctional environment in which he had been raised had compromised his ability to discern basic social and moral norms. Thompson presented evidence that Harold and Edith Shelton, Elijah and Martha's parents, had deliberately isolated their children, depriving them of formal education and normal social contact. The defendant, Thompson argued, is the product of generational isolation and possibly of previous endogamy. He himself is the son of first cousins who raised him to believe that the outside world was hostile and that the family should remain introspective. The prosecution, represented by Amanda Lewis, acknowledged the mitigating circumstances but maintained that Elijah understood the nature of his actions. The defendant showed the ability to interact with the community when necessary, to conduct basic business, and to deliberately hide the true nature of his relationship with his sister, Lewis argued. These are not the actions of someone unable to distinguish right from wrong. Martha Shelton testified behind closed doors. Edited excerpts from her testimony, later released, revealed a pattern of psychological manipulation that began after her parents' death when she was 29 and Elijah was 33. According to Martha, Elijah had gradually assumed full control over all aspects of their lives, isolating her more and more and convincing her that the outside world represented a threat to their safety and family unit. He told us we were special, Martha said. That our blood was pure, that our children would be strong because they wouldn't be contaminated by the outside world. At first I resisted, but after years alone with him, I started to believe. Dr. Richard Foster, a psychiatrist specializing in social isolation and abusive family dynamics, testified as an expert, explaining to the jury the profound effects of extreme isolation and prolonged indoctrination. What we see here is a classic case of an alternative reality built by isolation, he explained. When a person is systematically excluded from all normative social references, their perception of what is acceptable can be radically distorted. The trial also highlighted the failure of local institutions to identify and intervene in the situation. Evidence revealed that concerns had been expressed by at least 3 different people over the years: Reverend Miller, the neighbor Sarah Jenkins, and an employee of the Current River Supply Store, who had noticed similarities between the children and the adults who occasionally visited the store. In none of these cases was there a proper follow-up by the authorities, revealing systemic failures in monitoring isolated communities and in protecting vulnerable people in remote rural areas. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury found Elijah Shelton guilty of incest but recommended leniency due to the mitigating circumstances. Judge Elalina Simmons sentenced him to 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months and ordered compulsory psychological treatment. In her final statement, Judge Simmons noted, "This case represents a collective failure, not just of the defendant, who is still responsible for his actions, but of a society that allows entire families to be cast aside by our protection and support systems." Geographical isolation should not mean institutional abandonment. As for the children, the court ordered them to remain temporarily in state custody while Martha received intensive psychological treatment. The ultimate goal was family reunification, since Martha showed the capacity to properly care for the children and keep them integrated into the general community. The children were placed in a foster home in a neighboring county where they began to receive formal education and medical treatment for their various conditions. Thomas, the eldest, showed remarkable resilience and adaptability, quickly catching up with his peers academically. Despite an initial delay, Suddy had more difficulty with social adaptation but responded well to treatment for her strabismus and other health problems. Jacob, the youngest and most severely affected by genetic disorders, underwent several surgeries to correct malformations and began intensive care for his developmental delay. Comprehensive genetic tests revealed that all 3 children were carriers of multiple genetic anomalies resulting from endogamy. Thomas primarily presented minor problems, such as polydactyly, which had already been surgically corrected, and a predisposition to certain autoimmune diseases. Suddy had more significant problems, including a rare enzyme deficiency that affected her metabolism and required continuous medication. Jacob, as previously identified, suffered from Apert syndrome, among other complications that would require lifelong medical care. The Shelton case triggered significant policy changes in Missouri and neighboring states. The Shelton Law, approved by the state legislature in 1985, established more rigorous protocols for monitoring families in isolated areas, including regular visits by social workers and wellness checks for all children, regardless of formal complaints. Elijah Shelton served 22 months of his sentence before being released on parole in 1985. As a condition of his release, he was prohibited from returning to the family property while the children were under Martha's care and was required to undergo continuous therapy and regular supervision. Martha, after 2 years of intensive care, regained custody of the children in 1984. With state assistance, she moved to a small house on the outskirts of West Plains, where the children were able to continue their studies and medical treatment. She completed her GED, the high school equivalent diploma, and eventually got a job as a library assistant at a local library. The Shelton family's story continued to evolve in the following decades. Thomas, the eldest son, overcame the adversities of his upbringing and graduated in social work, dedicating his career to helping children in vulnerable situations. Suddy faced more difficulties, battling chronic health problems and psychological challenges related to her past, but she eventually found stability as an artist and artisan. Jacob, despite his physical and cognitive limitations, achieved a semi-independent life with community support and became an advocate for the rights of people with disabilities in rural areas. The Shelton case remains an iconic study in social work and law schools across the country, illustrating the complex intersections between geographic isolation, rural poverty, dysfunctional family dynamics, and institutional failures. It also highlights the physical and psychological effects of endogamy not only on the children directly affected but also on subsequent generations. In 2002, 20 years after the initial discovery, Margaret Wilson, then retired, reflected on the case in an interview with a local newspaper. "What's most striking looking back," she said, "is how something so extreme could happen practically in plain sight. This wasn't a cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was less than 30 kilometers from a city in a country with resources and institutions supposedly capable of protecting the vulnerable. It makes us wonder how many other similar cases exist, hidden in remote valleys or in plain view, hoping someone will pay attention." The original Shelton property, abandoned for years, was eventually sold by the state in 1990. The cabin has collapsed over time, but the land remains a silent reminder of how extreme isolation can distort realities and perpetuate cycles of harm for generations. If you've watched this far, it's because you care about these cases that mark families forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here, so I know who really cares about the search for the truth." Don't forget to like this video and share it with those who also value understanding the complexities of human nature and the importance of effective protection systems. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now to follow more investigations into cases that make us reflect on our society and collective responsibility.